It was the kind of heavy July night Miami is famous for, the air thick enough to cling to skin, the city's humidity wrapping around everything like a second layer. On July 14th, 2023, 27-year-old Samantha Hayes, Sam, to friends and to the 200,000 subscribers who followed her on OnlyFans, walked across the polished deck of a luxury charter yacht, her sequined dress catching the glow of the deck lights. She had been building her online brand for 2 years, her image carefully cultivated, glamorous, playful, a little unpredictable. That night was supposed to be another step in that world, a private after-hours party where being seen was as important as who you were seen with. The yacht, the Elysian, was massive, more floating mansion than boat. It had 3 decks, a crew of 5, and enough alcoves and private rooms for guests to disappear into for hours without anyone noticing. The guest list that night was curated. 10 influencers, 3 high-net-worth investors, 2 music producers, and a handful of others who floated between the worlds of nightlife and money. The crew moved in the background, silent and efficient, topping up glasses, clearing empty plates, and making themselves invisible. Shortly after departure, Sam was seen laughing with friends at the bow, the skyline of Miami glowing behind her. At 11:52 p.m., she posted an Instagram story. 3 champagne flutes clinking together, dark water sliding past in the background, muffled laughter almost drowned out by the low thump of music. At first glance, it looked like nothing. Just another party post. Later, that short clip would become a crucial timestamp in reconstructing her final known movements. By midnight, the night was hitting its peak. The upper deck was crowded, the music louder, and conversations broke off into smaller, more private exchanges. Sam was still visible, laughing near the railing, leaning in close to whisper something to another guest, disappearing briefly toward the stern with a drink in her hand. Witnesses later argued about the sequence of events. Some swore they saw her near the main bar after 1 a.m. Others insisted she had gone below deck. One guest claimed she had left the yacht early on a smaller tenderboat, something no crew member could confirm. The problem was, no one had been watching closely enough to be sure. Sometime between 1:15 and 1:30 a.m., the details began to blur. People remembered flashes of silver as her dress caught the light, then nothing. One man thought she'd gone to change shoes in her cabin. Another remembered her heading toward the lower deck restroom. None of these accounts lined up in a way investigators could piece together with certainty. For a while, she was just assumed to be elsewhere, mingling, resting, maybe even making a phone call in private. After all, it wasn't unusual for someone to drift away from the crowd on a yacht like this. By 2 a.m., Sam was no longer in anyone's direct line of sight. The party continued without pause, guests still drinking, the yacht slicing silently through black water. Below deck, crew members worked their cleanup routine, gathering empty bottles and discreetly disposing of whatever was left behind. The sea was calm, the air warm. From the outside, nothing about the night appeared unusual. When the Elysian docked at 4 a.m., the mood on board had shifted. People were tired and quieter now as they made their way down the gangway toward waiting cars. The crew began their post-party tasks, wiping down surfaces, folding linens, and checking cabins. It was in this shuffle that the first opportunity to notice her absence passed. No one counted heads and no one asked where Sam was. She was simply not there, and no one realized it yet. It wasn't until later that morning that the first signs of concern began to surface. At 9:02 a.m., Jenna Collins, a model and close friend of Sam's who had also been at the party, sent her a casual text. "Where are you? Did you crash somewhere?" There was no reply. An hour later, Jenna tried calling. No answer. She sent another text, this time with a note of urgency. "People are asking. Please tell me you're okay." Still nothing. By midday, Jenna had reached out to mutual friends, none of whom had seen or heard from Sam since the night before. Around 1:30 p.m., she called Sam's assistant, who had access to her social media accounts. The assistant confirmed there had been no new activity on any platform since the 11:52 p.m. Instagram story. A significant detail, as Sam was known for posting even after long nights out. Her last phone activity, according to location data, placed her on the yacht in the early hours, but there was no record of her leaving the vessel. By 3 p.m., Jenna went to the Miami-Dade Police Department to file a missing person report. In most adult disappearance cases, there's a waiting period before law enforcement will act, but the circumstances here were unusual. A high-profile figure vanishing in the narrow window between midnight and docking, with dozens of witnesses who could not agree on when they last saw her. Within hours, detectives began contacting guests and crew, trying to establish a consistent timeline. That evening, the news broke. OnlyFans model missing after yacht party off Miami coast. The headline spread quickly, first on gossip sites, then mainstream outlets. Social media lit up with speculation. Some commenters treated it like entertainment, making crude jokes or suggesting publicity stunt theories. Others feared the worst. Hashtags began trending. News crews camped outside the marina, hoping for a glimpse of the yacht. For investigators, the case was already strange. If Sam had fallen overboard, someone should have noticed or at least heard something. If she had left early by tender boat, there should have been a record with the crew. But there was nothing. No confirmed sightings after 1:30 a.m., no evidence of her leaving the yacht alive, and no explanation from anyone on board that made sense. It was as though, in the middle of a party surrounded by people, Samantha Hayes had been erased. By the following morning, police divers began searching the waters along the Elysian's documented route. The ocean, as always, gave nothing back. By the time detectives began their first round of interviews, the story had already taken on a strange, slippery quality. 15 passengers and 5 crew members had been on board the Elysian that night, yet no two accounts of Samantha Hayes' final hours matched. In the cramped, neutral-toned interview rooms at Miami-Dade Police Headquarters, each witness seemed certain of their own version of events, but when those statements were lined up side by side, the picture fractured into pieces that didn't fit. One of the first guests questioned, a tech investor in his 40s, swore that Sam had left early. He claimed he'd seen her step into a smaller tender boat sometime after 1 a.m., wearing the same sequined dress she'd been in all evening. When pressed for details, who was with her, where she was headed, his certainty faltered. He thought she might have been with one of the crew, but couldn't say for sure. A different account came from a lifestyle influencer who had been on the upper deck most of the night. She was equally confident, but in the opposite direction. She remembered seeing Sam still on the main deck as late as 1:30 a.m., dancing barefoot with a drink in her hand. The music had been loud, the lighting dim, but she insisted there was no way Sam could have left the yacht without her noticing. Then came the most unsettling version. Another influencer, known for posting real-time party updates to her millions of followers, told detectives she had seen Sam near the yacht's stern, speaking in low, tense tones to a man she didn't recognize. She described his posture as confrontational, standing close, shoulders forward, hands moving sharply as he spoke. She didn't hear the words, but she remembered Sam's expression, tight, defensive, almost as if she wanted to step away but couldn't. That image lodged itself into the detective's notes, the first hint that this might not have been a disappearance born of accident or carelessness. The crew's statements only deepened the contradictions. The captain, Robert Bobby Lenz, claimed he had been on the bridge the entire night and hadn't seen Sam after midnight. A deckhand said he was certain he'd spotted her on the lower deck later than that, though he couldn't pin down the exact time. The yacht stewardess remembered clearing glasses from a table near the stern and seeing Sam walk past alone, but couldn't say whether she was heading to a cabin, the restroom, or somewhere else entirely. Every recollection seemed to overlap and contradict at the same time, a cloud of half-truths and blurred memories made worse by alcohol and the haze of the party atmosphere. Detectives quickly secured the security footage from the marina where the Elysian had docked that night. The grainy black-and-white images showed the guests disembarking one by one between 4:03 and 4:20 a.m. They counted all 15 passengers. Sam was not among them. The footage also showed crew members coming and going, unloading supplies and closing down the vessel for the night. But the absence of Sam on that tape raised an immediate, chilling question. If she hadn't disembarked, and no one could confirm she had left by tender boat, Where had she gone? In those first 48 hours, the simplest theory began to take shape: that Sam had gone overboard sometime after 1 a.m. The logic was straightforward. Parties on open decks, alcohol, the unpredictable roll of the sea. It had happened before. She could have fallen unnoticed, her absence overlooked until the yacht docked hours later. But the more investigators listened to the witnesses, the less that scenario seemed to hold. If she had fallen into the water, someone should have heard a splash, a cry, or anything. The weather had been calm. The sea was still. Even in the chaos of a party, the sound of a person going overboard at close range rarely went completely unnoticed. Then there was the problem of the tender boat claim. Several crew members confirmed that no small craft had left the yacht after they departed Miami that night. The tenders had been locked and secured, none were missing, and none showed signs of recent use. And still, one guest insisted they had seen her boarding one. Memory, the detectives knew, was fragile in these conditions. It bent easily under the influence of expectation, alcohol, and suggestion. But they couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was lying outright. As detectives sifted through the statements, certain names began to surface more than once. The description of the man seen speaking with Sam near the stern matched that of Victor Crane, a crypto trader who had boarded the yacht as a guest of another investor. He was known to several on board, but to Sam, he was a stranger. Multiple witnesses placed him near her at different points in the night, though none could say exactly when they had last seen the two together. By the third day, the investigative team had charted every account on a large whiteboard, mapping who claimed to see Sam and when. The result was a jagged, unreliable timeline. It was impossible to place her definitively anywhere after roughly 1:15 a.m., but equally impossible to prove she was gone before the yacht returned to the marina. That uncertainty, detectives knew, was dangerous. It gave space for any number of possibilities, and without physical evidence, the case would quickly stall. Still, one thing was clear. The people on board were not telling a consistent story. Whether the discrepancies came from drunken forgetfulness, self-preservation, or something far more calculated remained to be seen, as one investigator put it quietly to a colleague. "We've got 20 people who were in the same place at the same time, and they might as well have been on 20 different boats." Theories began to split into two camps. The first clung to the overboard explanation, banking on the idea that the ocean had simply swallowed her whole. The second pointed toward something darker, an incident on board that had been concealed before the yacht returned to shore. In either case, the inconsistencies were a problem. Too many people claimed certainty about events that didn't align. Too many details shifted with each retelling. And yet, there was one image from that night, buried in an influencer's testimony, that refused to fade from the investigators' minds. Sam at the stern, her posture defensive, a man standing too close, his voice low but sharp. That detail wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a seed of doubt strong enough to change the direction of the case. Because if that moment was the beginning of something, then whatever happened next hadn't been an accident at all. When detectives finally gained access to Samantha Hayes' digital life, the first thing they looked for was the moment it went silent. Her phone records painted a clear but deeply unsettling timeline. The last outgoing message she ever sent was at 1:12 a.m., just minutes after witnesses had last reported seeing her alive. It was short and typed quickly, the kind of text that suggested urgency rather than casual conversation. "I don't feel safe. He's following me." The recipient wasn't a friend from the party or a family member. It was her personal assistant, the one who handled her brand partnerships and travel bookings. That assistant wouldn't see the message until hours later, when the sun was already up and Sam had been missing for nearly 8 hours. By then, whatever had prompted it was no longer in the present. It had already happened. They traced the moments before that text. At 12:47 a.m., Sam had posted what would become her final public update, a short Instagram story showing 3 champagne glasses on a white marble counter. The camera lingered just long enough to catch the blur of faces in the background, nothing unusual to her followers, just another quick flash of a party. But when detectives slowed the footage down frame by frame, One of those blurred faces became clear enough to identify. He was a man with short dark hair and a sharp jawline, leaning against the counter as if mid-conversation. It was Victor Crane. On paper, he was a 34-year-old crypto trader whose name meant little outside the insular world of high-stakes digital currency deals. Off paper, his name surfaced in sealed court records, in the whisper network of Miami nightlife, and in 2 prior police reports, both from women who had accused him of sexual assault at private events. Neither case had gone to trial. The complaints were quietly dropped. The connection between Sam and Victor wasn't clear. Friends said she didn't know him personally, though several guests had introduced them earlier in the evening. In every surviving image from the party, their proximity seemed coincidental, never too close, never too far. But the timestamp on her last text suggested that by the early hours, something about him had crossed a line. Detectives turned their attention to the Elysian security cameras. By law, vessels of that size were required to keep internal CCTV covering common areas and points of entry. The system on board was sophisticated, multiple wide-angle cameras feeding into a secure storage unit in the captain's quarters. When police served the subpoena, the captain, Robert Lenz, complied, but with an apologetic shrug. The footage from the party existed, he said, but the files between roughly 12:30 and 3 a.m. were corrupted. A system glitch had caused the drives to overwrite themselves before they could be backed up. To the detectives, the explanation felt thin. Corrupt files could happen, yes, but the timing was remarkable. The missing footage covered the exact window in which Sam was last seen, sent her final text, and presumably vanished. The cameras showed her boarding the yacht earlier in the night, mingling on the upper deck, then nothing, until they picked up again around 3:05 a.m., with a handful of guests slumped in chairs, drinks in hand, the party winding down. Sam was nowhere in those later frames. They pressed the captain for details. Had there been any maintenance on the system? Any power outages? He shook his head. The glitch, he insisted, was as much a mystery to him as it was to them. But his body language told a different story. Shoulders tense, gaze fixed just past the investigators rather than meeting their eyes. Without video, the case leaned harder on digital traces. The text to her assistant was run through forensic analysis, confirming it was sent from her phone at sea, using the yacht's onboard Wi-Fi. The signal pinged from a router near the crew's quarters, a part of the vessel that guests rarely visited unless invited. This detail was troubling. Why would Sam have been in that area at all, let alone in a moment when she felt unsafe? Investigators also recovered metadata from the Instagram story. It confirmed the video had been recorded in the yacht's main salon, minutes before 12:47 a.m. The coordinates placed the vessel roughly 7 miles off the Miami coast in open water. Whoever was in the background of that clip, Victor, was on board and within arm's reach of her less than half an hour before she sent that urgent text. The sequence was becoming clearer, even if the details weren't. Sometime after 12:47, she left the salon. By 1:12, she was in or near the crew's quarters, messaging for help. Within minutes after that, she vanished from both human memory and mechanical record. Detectives began combing through Victor Crane's history, his social media. Presence was minimal. No recent posts, no tagged appearances. His financial records showed erratic travel, often coinciding with high-profile parties in cities like Dubai, Ibiza, and Miami. The assault allegations from years earlier bore unsettling similarities. Private settings, alcohol, and guests who later claimed foggy memories of the night. In one case, the complainant had texted a friend that she felt unsafe shortly before she stopped answering messages. That case had ended with no charges, but now the pattern was impossible to ignore. Still, in a courtroom, patterns weren't proof. Without the CCTV footage, they had no direct evidence of what happened to Sam in that missing window of time. The text was alarming but ambiguous. The Instagram post was telling but circumstantial. Each piece hinted at danger without showing the act itself. The captain's glitch explanation lingered in the back of their minds. Technical experts were brought in to examine the drives. Their preliminary opinion was blunt. It was possible the files had been deleted intentionally before being overwritten. If true, that meant someone on board had not only known what happened to Sam, but had also taken deliberate steps to erase the visual record. For now, the only confirmed facts were chilling in their simplicity. At 12:47 a.m., Sam was alive, drinking champagne in the yacht's main salon, with Victor Crane, a blurred face behind her. At 1:12 a.m., she sent a private message that she felt unsafe, that someone was following her. By 4 a.m., the yacht docked without her, and the cameras that should have shown the truth were dark for the very hours she disappeared. And the man in the background of her final post, the one her text seemed to be warning about, was already gone, lawyered up, silent, and untouchable. For now. Publicly, the Elysian was marketed as one of Miami's premier luxury charter yachts, a place for high-profile clients to unwind under the stars with champagne in hand and the skyline glowing in the distance. Privately, its history told a far less polished story. When detectives began digging through the vessel's records, a pattern emerged. In the last 3 years alone, it had been chartered dozens of times for private events, and more than a few had ended with law enforcement involvement. Some reports were relatively harmless, noise complaints from waterfront residents and loud music carrying across the bay well past midnight. Others hinted at something darker, suspected drug activity, public intoxication, and in one case, an unresolved sexual assault allegation from 2021 involving a female guest who told police she woke up in a cabin with no memory of how she got there. That case never went to trial. The victim withdrew her statement weeks later, citing fear of retaliation. At the center of all these voyages was the captain, Robert "Bobby" Lenz. On paper, he was a seasoned maritime professional with decades of experience. Off paper, his reputation in Miami's charter community was more complicated. Several sources described him as a man who knew how to make problems disappear, whether that meant smoothing over a client's legal troubles or quietly adjusting paperwork to skirt inspection requirements. To his regular clientele, that willingness to bend rules was part of his appeal. To investigators, it was a red flag. When former crew members were approached, many refused to speak on record, but a few agreed to share what they knew under the condition of anonymity. One described a culture where guests were encouraged to drink heavily, use drugs openly, and trust that what happened on board would never leave the deck. Another recalled a night when a guest went missing for nearly 2 hours during a party. She was eventually found asleep in a cabin, but in that time, no one had noticed she was gone. The crew member's words were chilling. If someone actually vanished, you wouldn't know until the next day. People assume everyone's still around somewhere. They're too drunk or too distracted to care. It was exactly the kind of environment in which a disappearance like Samantha Hayes could unfold unnoticed. The setting wasn't one of constant surveillance or tight accountability. It was one where blurred timelines and half-remembered interactions were the norm. And for detectives, that made piecing together the truth exponentially harder. As they looked deeper, the suspicion grew that the party Samantha attended might not have been just about networking or celebrating. Maritime law enforcement officers familiar with the yacht explained that international waters and certain offshore zones could be exploited to carry out transactions beyond the easy reach of U.S. jurisdiction. If drugs, cash, or other illicit goods changed hands, a yacht like the Elysian, with its tight-lipped crew and discreet clientele, would be an ideal venue. That theory wasn't far-fetched. Several of the yacht's previous charters had included known figures from both the nightclub scene and organized crime investigations. Detectives began mapping out the guest list from the night of Samantha's disappearance against known criminal databases. A handful of names triggered interest, people with prior arrests for possession, fraud, and money laundering. None of these connections proved direct involvement in what happened to her, but they underscored a reality. This was not a random collection of party-goers. It was a network of people who operated in overlapping and often legally gray social circles. What made the yacht's history even more relevant was how often the captain's name surfaced in connection with missing or incomplete documentation. Ship logs were vague, omitting specifics about routes and timing. Crew manifests sometimes didn't match the actual number of people who had been on board. Fuel and supply receipts were altered or missing altogether. In an investigation where the timeline was already fractured, this lack of precise record-keeping was more than sloppy. It was obstructive. One detail in particular caught investigators' attention. In the 2021 assault case, the complainant had told police that she believed her attacker was a guest of a high-profile financial figure. That night, the yacht had made a sudden and unexplained course change, moving into an area outside of U.S. Coast Guard patrols for nearly 2 hours. When questioned, Captain Lenz had offered a benign explanation about avoiding rough water. Now, 2 years later, in the wake of Samantha's disappearance, detectives noted that the Elysian had once again taken a brief but deliberate deviation from its expected course, this time between 2:30 and 3 a.m., right in the window when she is believed to have vanished. Interviews with maritime law experts confirmed that such deviations could be strategic. In certain areas, surveillance is lighter and response times from law enforcement are slower. If someone wanted to dispose of contraband or a body, those stretches of water would be optimal. The implication was grim. If Samantha had been harmed on board, the yacht's movements that night could have been more than coincidence. By now, detectives had moved past the idea that the evening had been nothing more than champagne and music. The setting, the guest list, the captain's history. It all pointed toward an environment where criminal activity could easily occur under the guise of a party. Whether Samantha had been caught up in something she didn't understand or had been deliberately targeted was still unknown. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized this wasn't just about one missing woman. The Elysian had been a stage for questionable events for years, a floating sanctuary for people who valued privacy above law. And somewhere in that history, hidden in the patterns of course, changes, falsified logs, and silent witnesses, was the truth about what had happened to her. The challenge was no longer just finding out where Samantha had gone. It was breaking through a wall of secrecy that had been reinforced over years of profitable, untraceable voyages. And in that wall, the detectives were starting to see the faint outline of a crack. 3 days after Samantha Hayes vanished, investigators got their first chance to search the Elysian without the captain or crew controlling where they could and couldn't go. The yacht sat moored at the marina, quiet now, its glossy exterior hiding the possibility that somewhere inside might be the answer to a question the entire city was asking. What happened to her? Detectives arrived with a team of forensic technicians intent on combing every inch of the vessel from bow to stern. Every cabin, storage compartment, and mechanical space was checked. The main decks were spotless, almost unnaturally so, as though they had been deep cleaned in the days since the party. The cabins yielded nothing of immediate value. But it was when they reached the lower deck, in the narrow hallway leading to the crew's quarters, that something caught their attention. On the starboard side, there was a small restroom, basic, functional, and meant for crew use. Its door was locked. The captain explained that it had been out of order and unused during the charter, but he seemed hesitant when asked for the key. When he finally produced it, the tech stepped inside. At first glance, it was unremarkable. The air smelt faintly of bleach. The surfaces gleamed. But years of forensic work had taught them that what you can't see often matters more than what you can. Behind the toilet's water tank, almost hidden in the shadowed gap between porcelain and wall, was a faint reddish-brown smear. It was small, partially wiped away, but unmistakable to trained eyes. Swabs were taken immediately. The team expanded their inspection, spraying luminol across the tiled floor, the walls, and the underside of the sink. In the bluish glow that followed, a much larger pattern emerged: spatter under the sink basin, droplets along the baseboards, and streaks on the lower part of the wall. These weren't the random marks left by a nosebleed or a cut finger. The distribution suggested force, the kind of sudden impact that drives blood outward. Samples were rushed to the lab. While those results were pending, the restroom was photographed from every angle, each faint trace documented. The captain insisted he had no idea how blood could have ended up there. He repeated that the restroom had been locked and unused for the duration of the party, but investigators noted the fresh scent of cleaning products, the slightly sticky feel of a floor that had been mopped too hastily, and the fact that the latch on the inside of the door had been engaged before they forced it open. Someone had been in there, and whoever it was had wanted to keep others out. When the DNA results came back, there was no longer any doubt. The blood was a match for Samantha Hayes. The volume wasn't massive, but it was enough to suggest a significant injury, a blunt force impact to the head, severe enough to cause heavy bleeding and likely unconsciousness, but not necessarily immediate death. That distinction mattered. It meant that, at least for some period after the injury, she could still have been alive. The weight of that finding shifted the entire investigation. For 3 days, this had been treated officially as a missing person case, with the possibility, however slim, that she had left the yacht of her own accord or suffered an accidental fall into the water. Now, the presence of her blood in a locked crew restroom turned it into something else entirely, a suspected crime scene. The theory of her slipping overboard began to crumble. The evidence suggested that something had happened to her inside the yacht, in a place the public and most passengers were never meant to see. Detectives began reconstructing the layout in their minds. The crew restroom was close to the service hallway, not far from the galley and maintenance areas. It was a space that could be accessed without being noticed by guests on the main deck. If Samantha had been led or chased down there, it could have happened without most people on board realizing she was gone. And with music and conversation filling the air above, the sounds of a struggle might never have carried. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a grim turning point. It gave investigators a physical location, a point in space and time where they knew she had been injured. But it also raised chilling questions. If she had been hurt there, what had happened next? Had she been moved immediately or left for a time before someone decided what to do with her? And, most crucially, who else knew about it? Forensic techs went back over the yacht with renewed intensity, looking for transfer evidence. Traces of blood on carpets, smudges on door frames, fibers or footprints that might show a path from the restroom to another part of the vessel. Small flecks were found on the inside of the restroom door, as though a hand had braced against it while smeared with blood. A single sequin, matching the dress she was last seen wearing, was lodged between the tile and the baseboard, just inside the threshold. This was no longer the search for a woman who had vanished into the ocean. It was the hunt for proof of what had been done to her on that yacht and by whom. And though the blood told them she had suffered a head injury, it told them nothing about whether it had been the result of a fall, a deliberate blow, or something else entirely. That answer would have to come from somewhere else on board, or from the people who had been there when it happened. Somewhere in the quiet, gleaming spaces of the Elysian, there were still secrets. The locked restroom had given up one of them. The next step was finding the rest. In the days following the discovery of Samantha Hayes' blood in the locked crew restroom, detectives turned their focus to the 5 people who had been paid to work aboard the Elysian that night. The passengers' stories had been inconsistent, but the crew's silence was beginning to feel calculated. Each had been questioned before, but now, with forensic evidence in hand, the tone shifted. These were no longer casual interviews. They were interrogations. One by one, the crew members were brought back into the station, separated from each other, and pressed for details about the hours surrounding 1:20 a.m., the last period in which Samantha could be placed on the yacht alive. It was deckhand Miguel Torres who cracked first. At 26, he was the youngest on board, hired only a few months earlier. In the first interview, he'd claimed he hadn't seen Samantha at all after midnight. Now, faced with the fact that her blood had been found mere feet from his usual post in the service hallway, his story changed. He admitted that he'd seen her that night, alone at first, moving unsteadily toward the crew restroom. He said she looked dizzy, as though she might be drunk or disoriented, and that her hand brushed the wall for balance. Behind her, a few steps back, was Victor Crane. Miguel described Victor's pace as deliberate, his eyes fixed on her as they both disappeared from view. When detectives asked what happened next, Miguel hesitated. He claimed that less than a minute later, he heard a loud, sudden thud from inside the restroom, something heavy connecting with a hard surface, followed by silence. He stood frozen, unsure whether to check, but admitted he didn't. Instead, he walked in the opposite direction, telling himself it was none of his business. When asked why, his answer was quiet but telling: because of who he is, and because I want to keep my job. It was the first account that placed Victor and Samantha together in the exact location where her blood was later found, and at the exact time she seemed to vanish from the party. But the lead was far from airtight. Another crew member, a stewardess named Claire Morton, directly contradicted Miguel's timeline. She told investigators she had passed by that same restroom several times throughout the night and never saw it locked, never heard anything unusual. In her memory, the door had always been slightly ajar, the light on inside empty whenever she glanced in. The conflicting accounts made it impossible to confirm whether Samantha had been trapped inside that space or if Miguel's recollection was colored by fear, guilt, or some other motive. Still, his statement aligned too closely with the physical evidence to be ignored. Detectives began to suspect that at least some of the crew were deliberately shaping their stories to protect certain people on board. The missing CCTV footage remained the investigation's largest obstacle. Without it, they had no way to prove whether Miguel's description of events was accurate or whether Victor had even entered the restroom after her. The captain continued to insist that the hours of corrupted footage were an unfortunate technical failure, but every new inconsistency in the crew's statements made that explanation harder to accept. When detectives reached out to Victor Crane for comment, they didn't get him. They got his attorney. Within hours of learning his name had been mentioned in connection with the restroom, Victor had retained one of Miami's most sought-after criminal defense lawyers, a man known for representing clients with deep pockets and serious reputational stakes. Through his attorney, Victor categorically denied following Samantha anywhere that night, denied entering the crew quarters, and denied ever being alone with her. He claimed he spent the entire evening on the upper deck with other guests, enjoying drinks and conversation. When asked for witnesses to verify that, his legal counsel said only that several people could vouch for him, but no names were provided. The optics were obvious to everyone involved. Here was a man whose blurred face had appeared in her final Instagram post, whose presence matched the warning text she had sent at 1:12 a.m., now accused by a crew member of following her into the exact room where her blood was later found. And yet, without a recording or a witness willing to stand by their story in court, the case against him was paper thin. Miguel's fear was palpable. He admitted that after hearing the thud, he'd seen Victor reappear in the hallway minutes later, alone, his expression calm. The door to the restroom was closed. Miguel didn't check inside until much later, when he found it locked from the inside. He assumed Victor had taken the key from the maintenance wall and relocked it before leaving, but he couldn't be sure. His memory of that night, like so many others, was a mixture of vivid moments and blurred gaps, made worse by the pressure of speaking against someone who seemed untouchable. For detectives, the contradictions were maddening. Miguel's account gave them a possible sequence, but Claire's denial undermined it. The rest of the crew claimed to have noticed nothing unusual, a fact that seemed either highly convenient or willfully dishonest. And all the while, Victor Crane's silence through his attorney kept him just out of reach. What they did know was that Samantha had ended up injured in that restroom. Someone had locked the door after she bled there. And someone on that yacht knew exactly how and why it happened. But until the crew's stories aligned, or someone decided their loyalty was worth less than the truth, the investigation would remain trapped in the narrow hallway outside that locked door, staring at the place where the answers began and then abruptly vanished. The crime lab's report on the evidence from the elision came in on a humid Miami morning, and it was the kind of document that shifted the investigation's weight immediately. Beneath the luminol glow that had revealed Samantha Hayes' blood, chemical testing confirmed high concentrations of sodium hypochlorite, bleach, inside the crew restroom's floor drain. This wasn't the faint trace left from a weekly cleaning. The levels suggested a deliberate pour directly into the drain, an effort to strip away anything that could be traced. The drain cover itself had a faint chalky residue where the liquid had dried, a detail consistent with a hasty cleanup. Forensics noted that while bleach could break down blood proteins, it rarely removed all traces, especially if applied quickly and without thorough scrubbing. Whoever cleaned that room hadn't had the luxury of time. The detail mattered. It meant that after Samantha bled in that space, someone made an active decision to erase the evidence. This wasn't the scene of an accident left as it happened. It was a place where someone had intervened, trying to control what would and wouldn't be found later. That knowledge deepened the unease in the case. Detectives were no longer considering whether foul play had occurred, but who on that yacht had taken the risk of tampering with a crime scene while still at sea. In the process of re-examining the restroom, a technician noticed something almost invisible. Along the thin vertical gap where the door latched into the frame were several tiny metallic flecks. Under a magnifier, they were revealed as fragments of sequins, their shine dulled by a coating of dust and a faint smear of grime. Forensic analysis compared them to photographs of the dress Samantha had worn that night, silver, sequined, the fabric prone to shedding when snagged. The match was exact. The location of the fibers suggested they had been pulled free when the dress made contact with the doorframe, likely during a moment of force, either someone pushing past the door or being pushed into it. This small find connected Samantha physically to the doorway itself, adding to the blood evidence already inside. Now detectives could envision the sequence. She entered that restroom, or was forced inside, her dress brushing the frame hard enough to leave a trace. She was injured, she bled, and afterward, someone cleaned. The sequencing wasn't perfect, but the fragments were there. The next step was the most difficult, finding her. Without a body, the forensic details were powerful but incomplete. Detectives consulted with a maritime law and oceanography expert to understand what might have happened if Samantha had been removed from the yacht before it docked. The expert explained the speed and unpredictability of the Gulf Stream, which runs just a few miles off the Florida coast. Depending on where she entered the water, she could have been carried miles away in a matter of hours, the currents pulling her far from the yacht's documented route. If she had been cast into open water in the early morning hours, by sunrise, she might already be outside the most practical search zones. Divers began their work with that grim understanding. For 3 days, they swept the waters along the Elysian's course, fanning outward in slow, deliberate arcs. They examined floating debris, checked markers and buoys, and scanned the sea floor where depth allowed. They found fishing gear, plastic waste, and once a tattered black jacket, but no trace of Samantha. The sea, vast and without sentiment, gave nothing back. The absence of her body quickly bled into the public narrative. In the first days after her disappearance, the tone online had been sympathetic. Influencer accounts reposted her last Instagram story with captions like, "Find Sam." Hashtags called for justice. But as the days passed without a recovery, the conversation began to fracture. Comment sections filled with doubt and speculation. Some claimed she had staged her own disappearance as a form of extreme publicity. Others suggested she had fled to escape financial trouble or personal scandal, citing her carefully managed online persona as proof she could construct elaborate narratives. The ugliest strain of commentary came from those who weaponized her work on OnlyFans against her. They argued that someone in her line of work was bound to attract the wrong kind of attention, twisting her disappearance into a cautionary tale rather than a crime. To them, the lack of a body meant the absence of a victim. Yet, in the same threads, there was another camp. People convinced that Victor Crane, the reclusive crypto trader seen in her final post, was directly involved. They pointed to the text she had sent at 1:12 a.m., saying she didn't feel safe, and to the statement from deckhand Miguel Torres, placing Victor right behind her as she walked toward the crew restroom. They shared screenshots of news articles, linked his name to past allegations, and argued that the physical evidence, the blood, the bleach, the sequined fibers, painted a picture too damning to ignore. Inside the investigation, detectives tuned out the noise. Theories born in online comment sections wouldn't hold in court. What mattered was evidence they could put before a judge or jury. The chemical signature in the drain, the match between the fibers in her dress, and the timeline built from witness statements, however inconsistent. The problem was the same as it had been from the beginning. Each piece was compelling, but none of it was definitive proof of what happened after she left that restroom. The bleach told them there had been an attempt to erase her presence. The fibers told them she had been at the threshold, likely under duress, but neither could say whether she left the yacht alive or dead. The ocean's silence was not just an absence of her, it was an absence of the single piece of evidence that could close the loop. For the detectives, the growing body of forensic detail created a cruel paradox. Every discovery brought them closer to understanding the sequence of events, but without Samantha herself, the picture could never fully resolve. And somewhere, they knew, was the person who had locked that door, poured that bleach, and stepped back into the party as if nothing had happened. The question now wasn't whether Samantha had been harmed on the Elysian. The evidence for that was overwhelming. The question was how long the truth could be kept hidden without the one thing the ocean still refused to give back. The investigation had been grinding forward in slow, uneven steps, each new piece of evidence adding weight, but not quite breaking the case open. That changed when a small team of forensic divers was assigned to search the marina's waste collection area, an overlooked corner of the investigation, but one that sometimes yielded the kinds of objects people thought they had gotten rid of for good. The marina's dumpsters and sealed refuse containers were routinely emptied into a waste barge that serviced all vessels moored there. If someone from the Elysian had thrown away something incriminating after the yacht returned, it might still be sitting in that chain of disposal. In the damp, chemical-smelling air of the waste barge, the divers and evidence technicians began methodically sorting through sealed black trash bags. Most contained the predictable debris of luxury charters, empty bottles of imported liquor, food packaging, and paper towels. But one bag stood out. It was heavier than the rest, double-tied, with a faint metallic rattle inside when it was moved. Its disposal tag matched the Elysian's assigned number for that night. When the technicians cut it open, they found shards of green glass, each edge dulled by dried liquid and time. Among the larger pieces was the neck of a champagne bottle, its foil still partially intact, its jagged rim stained a deep reddish brown. Back at the lab, the object told its story quickly. Fingerprint analysis found multiple clear impressions belonging to Samantha Hayes on the glass. DNA testing confirmed that the dark residue on the neck was her blood. The edges of the break suggested the bottle had been intact at the moment of impact, shattering against a hard surface, most likely her skull. A wound pattern analysis, done in consultation with a forensic pathologist, concluded that the bottle had almost certainly been used as a blunt weapon, delivering a focused blow strong enough to fracture the glass and cause heavy bleeding. This single piece of evidence narrowed the critical timeline. Whatever happened in that crew restroom likely began before 1:30 a.m., because by then she would have already sustained the head injury that produced the blood pattern investigators had documented. The champagne bottle wasn't just a link, it was a weapon, one that had been deliberately removed from the yacht and thrown into the trash rather than washed and stored like the dozens of other bottles used that night. Whoever discarded it understood that it connected directly to Samantha and to the violence she suffered. The find reignited a quiet urgency among the detectives. They reassembled their working timeline, layering witness statements, forensic evidence, and yacht movement logs. Samantha was last seen on social media at 12:47 a.m. She sent her final text at 1:12 a.m., indicating she felt unsafe and was being followed. By shortly after 1:20 a.m., Miguel Torres placed her walking toward the crew restroom with Victor Crane behind her. Now, with the champagne bottle, investigators could place her injury in that same window, in that same location. The chain was tightening. Still, a central question hung in the air. If she had been injured before the yacht returned to shore, why wasn't her body found on board? Without an answer, the case risked stalling in the gap between probable cause and provable fact. The evidence said she'd been hurt. The evidence said someone had cleaned up after her. But the absence of her body meant the possibility of multiple defense strategies, each capable of introducing reasonable doubt. Detectives decided to revisit the captain. Robert Bobby Lentz had grown more guarded in recent interviews, his answers shorter, his tone more defensive. This time, they pressed him not about the restroom or the missing CCTV footage, but about the yacht's auxiliary storage compartments, spaces not visible to guests, used for everything from maintenance supplies to emergency gear. On most vessels, these compartments were small, inconvenient to access, and unremarkable. On the Elysian, they were unusually large, tucked away in areas where crew could move without being seen from the main deck. When the question was raised, the captain's reaction was immediate and telling. His posture shifted, his jaw tightened, and his eyes dropped to the table for the briefest moment before he answered. He claimed the compartments were empty, used only for spare parts and cleaning equipment, and had been inspected before every charter. But detectives noted his sudden change in demeanor, the kind that suggested the question had touched something sensitive. The discovery of the champagne bottle had changed the stakes. It wasn't just another piece of circumstantial evidence. It was a tangible object that had been in Samantha's hands and then used to harm her. It had been hidden, removed from the yacht, and discarded in a place the person responsible thought no one would ever look. Yet here it was, telling them exactly what it had been part of. The marina's waste barge had yielded a smoking gun. Now the focus shifted to where the rest of the story might be hiding, whether in the compartments the captain claimed were empty or in the spaces on board that had so far avoided scrutiny. Because if the weapon had been stashed long enough to make it back to shore, there was a chance that something else, something far more damning, had been hidden long enough to vanish entirely. The break came when detectives finally secured a court order to go beyond surface inspections and physically dismantle parts of the Elysian. Until now, every search had been constrained to what could be opened without damaging the yacht: cabin doors, unlocked lockers, visible storage spaces. But with the order in hand, they could remove fittings, pull apart walls, and expose whatever might have been hidden from view. Their first focus was the crew restroom, the cramped space that had already yielded Samantha Hayes' blood, bleach traces in the drain, and the timeline-shifting discovery of the champagne bottle. If the truth was anywhere, they believed it would be here. Two forensic specialists began at the far wall, where plumbing lines disappeared behind a smooth laminate panel. On paper, the space behind it contained nothing more than pipes and insulation. The captain had described it as sealed, inaccessible, without tools, and irrelevant to the investigation. But when the screws came free and the panel was pried away, they uncovered something very different. A narrow, dust-coated crawl space running along the wall, just wide enough for a crouched person to move through. It was a maintenance access point the crew used to service plumbing, invisible to guests and unlisted in the yacht's public layout. Inside, the air was stagnant, carrying a faint metallic tang that the techs recognized immediately. Resting in one shadowed corner was a crumpled towel, stiff with dark stains later confirmed as blood. Wedged near it was a shattered smartphone, its screen spider-webbed, its casing dented as if it had been stepped on. Forensics would later confirm it was Samantha's, the same phone that had sent her final text at 1:12 a.m., warning that she didn't feel safe. A few feet away lay a single high-heeled shoe, silver, its strap broken, its heel scuffed deep as though dragged along metal. The stains on the towel told their own story. Blood flow analysis showed they were from slow, consistent bleeding, patterns consistent with a person lying on their side for an extended period. This, combined with the location and the items left behind, suggested something chilling. Samantha had been alive in that crawl space for hours after her injury. The space had no ventilation, no light, and no way to call for help once her phone had been taken from her. Above her, the party continued, music and conversation masking the reality hidden just a few feet below. Armed with this evidence, detectives re-interviewed the crew. The pressure was different now. This wasn't about speculation. It was about explaining physical items that should never have been there. Eventually, a younger deckhand broke. His voice was low, his phrasing careful, but the admission was clear. Shortly after the incident in the restroom, he said, Victor Crane had pulled aside two crew members and told them to deal with it until they reached deeper waters. The instruction was deliberate and cold. The deckhand described lifting Samantha with another crewman, noting that she was breathing but unresponsive, and placing her inside the crawl space. They shut the panel and returned to their duties as though nothing had happened. When asked why he hadn't reported this earlier, his answer was heavy with resignation. "Because I knew what they were going to do next," he said, "and by then, I was already part of it." It was a statement that confirmed detectives' worst fears, that her concealment had not been a panic-driven accident, but a calculated step in a plan to remove her from the yacht entirely. With this new account, investigators turned to the vessel's movement logs. On paper, the captain's logbook described a straightforward return from open water to the marina, but the GPS data told a different story. At 2:37 a.m., the Elysian had deviated from its expected route, steering southeast instead of back, toward shore. The detour lasted nearly 2 hours and took the yacht into a patch of ocean rarely patrolled by the Coast Guard, a gap between overlapping jurisdictions that maritime law experts quietly referred to as a blind zone. This was no navigational error. Experts confirmed the waters were calm that night, visibility was good, and there was no reason to divert for safety. The detour, they said, was intentional. If someone wanted to dispose of a body without detection, this stretch of water, far enough offshore to be outside regular patrol routes, would be the ideal location. The fact that the course change ended just before 4 a.m., with the yacht arriving back at the marina on schedule, reinforced the impression of a calculated window of opportunity. The crawl space evidence in the whistleblower's statement brought the night into sharper, darker focus. Samantha had entered the crew restroom sometime after 1:20 a.m., followed closely by Victor Crane. She suffered a head injury, likely from the champagne bottle later recovered from the yacht's trash. Instead of seeking medical help, the crew, acting under Victor's orders, hid her in the crawl space, removed her phone, and kept her there while the yacht continued to sail. When the vessel reached the unpatrolled waters during the course deviation, she was removed. Whether she was alive at that moment or had already succumbed to her injuries remained uncertain. The discovery of her broken phone in that hidden compartment added another layer. The device's casing damage suggested deliberate destruction, likely to ensure no calls, messages, or location data could be recovered. Forensic analysts would later retrieve partial fragments from its memory, but nothing that revealed her final minutes conscious. The single shoe was equally telling, its broken strap and scuffed heel, implying either a struggle or a hurried movement through the tight metal-lined space. Detectives knew the crawl space find would change the tone of every interview from this point on. The captain could no longer claim ignorance of events in the crew areas. The crew could no longer feign uncertainty about whether Samantha had been harmed. The physical reality of the hidden space, its dimensions, its contents, its proximity to the restroom, left little room for denial. What remained was the gap between the moment the panel was closed and the moment the yacht returned to shore. In that 2-hour detour lay the final act of the night, the one no one on board had yet admitted to seeing. And without the ocean giving her back, that gap remained the most dangerous part of the story. Dangerous because it was where speculation met silence, and where silence was protecting the person who had given the order to deal with it until it was too late. When the whistleblower's statement was finally on record and the forensic evidence laid out in meticulous detail, detectives called Miguel Torres back in. For days, the deckhand had clung to partial truths, hedging his words to avoid full responsibility. But now, confronted with the reality that every detail of the cover-up was known, he broke. His voice was low, almost hollow, as he described the moment everything shifted that night. Samantha had been in the crew restroom, standing near the sink, when Victor Crane followed her in. The argument began quietly, but escalated fast. Victor, drunk and increasingly aggressive, demanded that she send him explicit photos directly from her phone, images he insisted would be worth her time. She refused, telling him to leave her alone. According to Miguel, Victor's tone turned sharp, his posture threatening. Then, in a single explosive moment, he grabbed a champagne bottle from the small shelf near the doorway and swung it. The glass shattered against the side of her head with a dull crack. She crumpled instantly, blood running down her temple. Miguel admitted he froze. Victor crouched over her, swearing under his breath, then turned to him with a look that left no room for negotiation. He told Miguel she was dead, or close enough, and that they couldn't have this problem on board. Within minutes, Victor had summoned 2 other crew members and given the order to hide her until they reached a point where no one could find her. They lifted her limp body, still faintly breathing, and carried her to the maintenance crawlspace behind the restroom wall. Miguel said he could hear her shallow breaths as they shut the panel, but Victor insisted she wouldn't last the night. For the next hour, the yacht continued on its original course, music and laughter carrying through the decks above, while Samantha lay in the dark compartment, her phone smashed, her breathing slow. Just after 3 a.m., the captain altered course, steering toward a stretch of unpatrolled open water. The detour, Miguel said, was prearranged. Victor had told the captain earlier in the night where they'd need to go if things went bad. When the yacht reached the designated area, the order came down to finish it. Miguel described opening the crawl space and finding Samantha still alive, her breathing faint but steady. Her skin was cold from the metal around her, her dress stained dark where the blood had pooled. Victor had already prepared a large duffel bag weighted at the bottom with tools from the maintenance locker. They lifted her inside, zipping it closed, the sound muffled under the thrum of the yacht's engines. No one spoke as they carried it to the stern. Out in the open air, with only the black expanse of ocean around them, Victor gave the nod. The bag was heaved over the side, hitting the water with a dull splash before vanishing beneath the surface. Miguel admitted that he didn't look away, that he saw the way the bag shifted slightly, as if something inside had moved. He knew then that she had still been alive. The medical examiner's later report confirmed what Miguel could not bring himself to say outright. Samantha Hayes died not from the head injury, but from drowning. Water had filled her lungs while her heart was still beating. The knowledge that she had been conscious, even if only for moments as she sank beneath the water, was almost unbearable for those who heard it. With Miguel's confession, prosecutors moved quickly. Victor Crane was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, his wealth and influence offering no shield against the evidence now stacked against him. Captain Robert Lenz was charged as an accessory after the fact for his role in steering the yacht to the disposal site and falsifying the vessel's course logs. 2 other crew members faced charges of evidence tampering and obstruction. The yacht itself was seized as evidence, its gleaming decks and luxury interiors now part of a crime scene that would be photographed, measured, and dissected in court. For Samantha's family, the truth was both a relief and a wound that cut deeper than before. They had answers now, painful, detailed answers, but the reality of what those final hours had been was almost too much to carry. The knowledge that she had been hidden aboard for hours, alive and injured, while help was only feet away, left them with a grief that no trial could ease. Public reaction was swift and visceral. The case had been followed obsessively for weeks, each new detail feeding speculation and outrage. But the revelation that she had been alive when placed in the water, trapped in a weighted bag, turned the story into something that shook even the most hardened observers. News anchors spoke of it with visible discomfort. Social media lit up with messages of horror and disbelief. Advocacy groups began calling for stricter regulations on private charters, for mandatory tracking of all passenger movements on large vessels, and for safety protocols that could prevent another death like this. Yet beneath the noise, one image persisted. The reality of that hidden crawl space, the soundless hours she spent inside, and the deliberate choice to take her from it only when the yacht had reached waters where the ocean could finish what Victor had started. It was a story not just of violence, but of calculated indifference, where every decision made after the first blow was about concealment, not life. The law would have its say. Victor would stand trial, his attorneys forced to contend with a confession, physical evidence, and a timeline that left little room for doubt. But for those who had pieced together the fragments of that night, the case had already delivered its verdict long before the court could. Samantha Hayes had boarded the Elysian expecting a night of celebration. What she found instead was a series of choices made by men who valued their own safety above her life, and who believed, until the evidence pulled them under, that the ocean would keep their secret forever.